How do you survive when the beast you're sacrificed to stops acting like your enemy? Dumped at a cursed king's gate as a blood price, Elena feels the ground shift the second his curse bends around her instead of tightening. One secret, one kingdom, and one very dangerous lie start to unravel fast. And when it snaps, everything you thought was fixed burns. The night Elena Hartwell was dragged to the gates of the Forbidden Vale, the sky wept ash and embers. She had always known fire, had always lived with its threat hovering over her shoulders like a vulture circling carrion. But this fire was different. This fire came from the torches of her own people, the villagers of Silverthorn who had once tolerated her presence in their midst, and now demanded her removal as though she were a plague, a blight upon their land that needed to be excised before it spread further into their carefully ordered lives. She stumbled over roots and stones as the guards dragged her forward, her wrists bound so tightly with coarse rope that she could feel the fibers cutting into her skin, drawing thin lines of blood that trickled down her palms and dripped onto the forest floor. The guards said nothing to her. They had not spoken a single word since they had torn her from the small cottage she shared with no one, the place where she had tried to build something resembling a life after everything else had been taken from her. Their silence was deliberate, calculated, designed to strip away whatever small dignity she might have clung to in these final hours. Elena had been 11 years old when her mother died. The memory still lived in her chest like a stone she could never swallow, could never spit out, heavy and cold and permanent. Her mother had been a herbalist, a woman of knowledge and quiet power, who had taught Elena the names of every plant in the forest, the properties of every root and leaf and flower that grew in the shadows of the ancient trees. She had been loved by some, feared by others, respected by most. But respect had not saved her when the fever came, when the sickness swept through Silverthorn like a scythe through wheat, cutting down the young and old alike without mercy or pattern. Elena's father had died when she was too young to remember his face. Her mother had spoken of him rarely, and when she did, her voice carried a weight that Elena had not understood until she was older, until she began to recognize the particular kind of grief that came from losing someone too soon, someone whose absence carved a permanent hollow in the architecture of your life. He had been a woodsman, her mother said. He had been kind. He had died in the winter, crushed beneath a falling tree during a storm that had raged for 3 days and 3 nights. And when they had found his body, the snow had already begun to bury him. After her mother's death, Elena had been taken in by the village healer, an elderly woman named Marjorie, who had agreed to continue Elena's education in the healing arts. For 6 years, Elena had worked in Marjorie's cottage, learning everything the old woman could teach her, grinding herbs into powders and steeping roots into tinctures, wrapping wounds and setting bones and sitting vigil beside sickbeds through long nights when death hovered close and breath came shallow and uncertain. She had been good at it. She had been talented even. Marjorie had said so, had told her that she had her mother's gift, that same instinct for knowing which plants would heal and which would harm, which combinations would bring relief and which would bring only deeper suffering. But talent had not been enough to save her when Marjorie died. The old woman had passed quietly in her sleep one autumn night, and Elena had woken to find her cold and still, her face peaceful in death in a way it had never been in life. The village had buried Marjorie with honor, had spoken words of gratitude for her decades of service, and then they had turned their attention to Elena, the 17-year-old orphan who now occupied the healer's cottage alone, and they had not liked what they saw. There had been whispers even then, quiet murmurs about how it was unnatural for someone so young to possess so much knowledge, how there was something unsettling about the way Elena moved through the forest as though she belonged there more than she belonged among people, how her eyes sometimes held a distant quality as though she were looking at things others could not see. The whispers had grown louder after the Beta's daughter fell ill with a wasting sickness that none of the village's remaining healers could cure, a sickness that ate away at the girl's strength day by day until she was nothing but skin stretched over bones, her eyes sunken and hollow, her breath rattling in her chest like dice in a cup. The Beta had come to Elena then, had stood in the doorway of the cottage with his hat in his hands, and desperation carved into every line of his weathered face, and he had begged her to help his daughter, to use whatever skills she possessed to pull the girl back from the edge of the grave. Elena had tried. She had tried everything she knew, had consulted every text Marjorie had left behind, had ventured deep into the forest to gather rare herbs and fungi that grew only in the darkest, dampest places where sunlight never reached. She had brewed potions and applied poultices and sat beside the girl's bed for days without sleep, watching and waiting for some sign of improvement that never came. The Beta's daughter had died on a morning when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds and the air smelled of coming snow. She had died quietly, slipping away between one breath and the next, and Elena had been there to witness it, to see the exact moment when life departed and left behind only an empty vessel, a thing that had once been a person, but was now merely flesh and bone and cooling blood. The Beta had arrived moments later, had burst into the room with hope still bright in his eyes, and Elena had watched that hope die just as surely as his daughter had died, watched it drain away and leave behind something dark and poisonous and seeking a target for its rage. He had not blamed her immediately. That had come later, after the funeral, after the girl had been laid in the cold ground and the village had gathered to mourn and to wonder how such a thing could have happened, how a girl so young and previously so healthy could have been taken so suddenly and so completely. Someone had suggested poison. Someone else had mentioned the strange herbs Elena had been seen gathering in the forest, herbs that no one else recognized, plants that grew in places where no decent person would venture. And then someone had remembered the way Elena's mother had been feared as much as she had been respected, had remembered the old stories about women who knew too much about plants and their properties, women who could heal but who could also harm, who walked the line between medicine and darker arts. The accusation, when it came, had been delivered by the village priestess, a severe woman named Sister Callista, who presided over the small temple at the center of Silverthorn, and who had never liked Elena or her mother, had never approved of the way they lived apart from the community, had never trusted the knowledge they possessed. Sister Callista had stood before the assembled villagers and declared that the Beta's daughter had not died of natural causes, that she had been murdered, poisoned by a girl who had been given too much freedom, too much power, too much access to things that should have been reserved for those with proper training and proper faith and proper respect for the natural order of things. Elena had tried to defend herself. She had stood before the village council and explained everything she had done, every treatment she had attempted, every herb she had used and why she had chosen it, but her words had fallen on ears that were already closed, minds that had already been made up. The Beta had sat at the head of the council table with his face carved from stone, and when Elena had finished speaking, he had simply nodded to the guards, and they had seized her arms and dragged her from the hall while she was still trying to explain, still trying to make them understand that she had done everything in her power to save the girl, that she had wanted nothing more than to see her recover. They had locked her in the temple's cellar, a cold stone room that smelled of damp earth and old incense, and they had left her there for 3 days with nothing but a bucket of water and a crust of bread that had gone stale and hard. Sister Callista had visited her once, had stood outside the locked door and spoken to her through the iron grating, her voice dripping with a satisfaction that made Elena's stomach turn. The priestess had told her that the village had reached a decision, that they had consulted the old laws and the old customs, and they had determined that Elena represented a debt that needed to be paid, a price that was owed to forces older and darker than any of them fully understood. On the morning of the 4th day, they had come for her. The guards had unlocked the cellar door and hauled her up into the weak winter sunlight, and Elena had seen the entire village gathered in the square, watching her with faces that ranged from fearful to satisfied to carefully blank. The Beta had been there, and Sister Callista and the other members of the council, all of them arranged in a semicircle like judges at a trial that had already reached its verdict. They had bound her wrists and loaded her onto a cart, and they had driven her through the village while people lined the streets and whispered behind their hands, pointing at her as though she were already something less than human, something that could be disposed of without guilt or consequence. The journey to the borders of the Forbidden Vale had taken most of the day. The cart had rumbled over rough roads and forest paths, jolting Elena until her bones ached and her muscles cramped, but the guards had not allowed her to rest or to relieve herself, or even to drink water. They had simply driven forward with grim determination, as though they were afraid that if they stopped even for a moment, their resolve might falter, their certainty might crack, and they might be forced to confront what they were actually doing, the reality of the act they were committing in the name of tradition and fear. As they had traveled, Elena had listened to the guards talking among themselves, their voices low, but not quite low enough. They had spoken of the curse that hung over the Forbidden Vale, the old stories that every child in Silverthorn learned at their mother's knee, tales of the king who had once ruled these lands with wisdom and strength before something had gone terribly wrong, before he had been transformed into something monstrous, something that was neither fully man nor fully beast, but some terrible combination of both. The curse had isolated him, had driven him into the mountains where he lived in a castle of crumbling stone and bitter memory, and no one who ventured into his territory was ever seen again. Every generation, the guards had said, the Moonfang Pack demanded a blood price, a sacrifice to appease the cursed king and keep him contained within his mountain fortress, to prevent him from descending into the valleys and visiting his rage upon the innocent villages that clustered at the edges of his domain. It was an old debt, they claimed, one that stretched back centuries to some original sin or broken treaty that no one could quite remember, but that everyone agreed must have been terrible indeed to warrant such an ongoing punishment. And Elena, they had decided, would be that sacrifice. Elena, the orphan girl with too much knowledge and too few allies, would be the one to pay a debt she had never incurred, would be offered up to a monster she had never wronged. Now, as the guards dragged her toward the massive stone gates that marked the entrance to the Forbidden Vale, Elena felt terror and fury warring inside her chest, each emotion fighting for dominance, each one threatening to overwhelm her completely. The gates loomed before her like the jaws of some enormous predator, ancient stone covered in moss and lichen and strange symbols that had been carved into the rock so long ago that weather and time had worn them almost smooth. Beyond the gates, she could see darkness, a thick forest that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Trees that grew so close together, their branches intertwined overhead like clasped fingers, blocking out the sky. The guards stopped a dozen paces from the gates. One of them produced a key from his belt, a massive iron thing that looked as old as the gates themselves, and he approached the barrier with obvious reluctance, his steps growing slower the closer he came. He inserted the key into a lock that Elena had not noticed until that moment, a mechanism so perfectly fitted to the stone that it was nearly invisible, and he turned it with a grinding sound that echoed through the forest like the growl of some enormous beast. The gates swung open slowly, their hinges screaming in protest, and cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond, air that smelled of pine needles and old snow, and something else, something Elena could not quite identify, but that made her skin prickle with instinctive warning. The guard who had opened the gates immediately stepped back, nearly stumbling over his own feet in his haste to put distance between himself and the entrance to the Vale. They untied the ropes that bound Elena's ankles but left her wrists secured, and then they shoved her forward, not quite hard enough to make her fall, but with enough force to make her stumble, to make her take several unwilling steps toward the open gates. She turned back to look at them, these men she had known all her life, men whose children she had treated for fevers and scrapes and childhood ailments, men whose wives had come to her for remedies and advice, and she saw no mercy in their faces, no regret, only a desperate need to complete this task and return to their homes, to convince themselves that they had done what was necessary, what was required, what was demanded by forces they could not control and should not question. Elena wanted to scream at them. She wanted to curse them, to tell them that they were cowards and murderers, that they were condemning her to death to save themselves from having to think too deeply about justice or mercy or the value of a single human life. But she knew that words would be wasted here, that nothing she could say would change their minds or alter her fate. So she simply stood there for a moment, memorizing their faces, burning the image of their cowardice into her memory, so that if by some miracle she survived this night, she would never forget what they had done, what they had been willing to do to preserve their own comfort and safety. Then she turned and walked through the gates. She did not run, did not stumble, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down or beg or collapse in terror. She walked with her head high and her shoulders back, even though her wrists were still bound and her feet were bare and bleeding from the rough treatment of the journey, and she crossed the threshold into the Forbidden Vale as though she were entering a ballroom rather than what everyone believed to be her tomb. Behind her, she heard the guards immediately begin pulling the gates closed, heard the grinding shriek of metal and stone as they sealed her inside, heard the heavy thunk of the lock engaging and the key turning, and then the rapid retreat of footsteps as the men fled back toward their village and their warm homes and their clear consciences. The sound of their departure faded quickly, swallowed by the thick forest, and then there was only silence, a silence so complete and profound that Elena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could hear the whisper of her breath and the rustle of her ragged dress as she turned to face the darkness that surrounded her. The forest inside the Forbidden Vale was unlike any forest Elena had ever seen, and she had spent most of her life among trees, had learned the ways of woods and wilderness at her mother's side. These trees were ancient, their trunks so wide that it would take 5 people with linked arms to encircle them, their bark dark and deeply furrowed, their branches reaching toward each other overhead to form a canopy so dense that even at midday, Elena suspected, very little light would penetrate to the forest floor. Now, with night approaching and the sun already sinking behind the mountains, the darkness was almost absolute, broken only by thin shafts of twilight that filtered through rare gaps in the leaves, pale and cold and insufficient. Elena stood still for a long moment, trying to let her eyes adjust to the gloom, trying to slow her racing heart and calm her breathing so she could think clearly about what she needed to do next. She could not simply stand here and wait to be found by whatever creatures inhabited this place, could not allow herself to become paralyzed by fear or overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. She was alone, yes, and abandoned, yes, and facing almost certain death, yes, but she was also alive, still breathing, still capable of movement and thought and action, and as long as those things remained true, she refused to simply surrender to despair. She began walking, choosing a direction almost at random since she had no map, no guide, no knowledge of the terrain or what might lie ahead. Her bound wrists made movement awkward, forced her to hold her arms at an uncomfortable angle to maintain her balance, and her bare feet found every sharp stone and broken branch on the forest floor, but she pushed forward anyway, putting one foot in front of the other, focusing on the simple mechanics of walking rather than on the fear that threatened to swallow her whole if she gave it even the smallest opening. As she walked, she became aware of sounds emerging from the silence, small noises that seemed to come from all directions at once, the rustle of something moving through the undergrowth, the crack of a branch breaking somewhere off to her left, the soft hoot of an owl, or what she hoped was an owl, though the sound seemed slightly wrong, slightly off in pitch or rhythm in a way she could not quite define. The forest was not as empty as it had first appeared, she realized. It was full of life, full of watching eyes and listening ears, full of creatures that knew she was here, that were tracking her movement through their territory, that were deciding whether she represented threat or prey or something else entirely. Elena forced herself to keep walking, forced herself not to think about what might be watching her from the shadows, not to imagine claws or fangs or other instruments of death. She focused instead on her surroundings, on noting the types of trees and plants she could see in the dim light, on looking for anything familiar, anything that might tell her something useful about where she was or how she might survive the night. She recognized oak and pine and something that might have been ash or elm, their bark pale against the darkness. She saw ferns growing in thick clusters near fallen logs, and mushrooms sprouting from rotting wood, and vines hanging from branches like rope or curtains. Some part of her mind, the part that her mother and Marjorie had trained, automatically cataloged the plants she saw, noting which ones were edible and which were poisonous, which ones had medicinal properties, and which were simply decorative or useless. She saw nightshade growing in the shadows, its berries gleaming like dark jewels, deadly and tempting. She saw foxglove standing tall and elegant, its purple flowers beautiful and toxic. She saw yarrow and comfrey, and what might have been wild ginger, plants she had used countless times in her healing work, plants that represented knowledge and power and survival if she could only find a way to harvest them with her hands still bound. The ground began to slope upward, and Elena realized she was climbing into the mountains that formed the heart of the Forbidden Vale. The trees grew sparser here, replaced gradually by rocks and scrubby brush, and hardy plants that could survive in thin soil and harsh conditions. The air grew colder, sharp enough to make her shiver in her thin dress, and she could see her breath misting in front of her face, pale clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed. She had been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one when she saw the light. It was faint at first, just a dim glow visible through the trees ahead. But as she drew closer, it resolved into firelight, orange and flickering, and utterly unlike anything natural or wild. Fire meant people, or at least meant something intelligent enough to kindle flame and maintain it, and Elena was not sure whether that realization filled her with hope or terror. People could mean help, could mean someone who might cut the ropes binding her wrists and offer her food and shelter and information about how to survive in this place. But people could also mean danger, could mean servants of the cursed king or bandits or worse, could mean cruelty and violence, and a death that might be slower and more painful than anything the forest itself would provide. She crept forward more carefully now, using the trees for cover, moving as quietly as her bare feet and bound hands would allow. The light grew brighter, and she began to make out details. A small clearing among the rocks, a fire burning in a ring of stones, and beside the fire, a structure that was not quite a house but was more permanent than a tent. A low building made of rough-hewn logs and fitted stone with a chimney from which smoke rose in a thin gray column. Elena circled around the clearing, staying in the shadows, trying to see if anyone was present, trying to determine whether this place represented salvation or threat. She saw no movement, heard no voices, but the fire was burning steadily and smoke rose from the chimney, which meant someone had been here recently, meant someone had laid the wood and struck the spark and built the structure, meant human hands and human intention and human presence. She was so focused on watching the cabin that she almost did not notice the figure until it was nearly upon her. He stepped out from behind a massive pine tree not 10 paces from where she crouched, and Elena's heart nearly stopped in her chest, because he had been there all along, had been standing absolutely still in the shadows, watching her as carefully as she had been watching the cabin, and she had not noticed him, had not heard him, had not sensed his presence until he chose to reveal himself. He was tall, taller than any man Elena had ever seen, with broad shoulders and a powerful build that spoke of immense physical strength. In the dim light filtering through the trees, she could not make out the details of his face, could see only the general shape of him, the way he held himself with absolute stillness, absolute control, like a predator that had no need to rush because it knew its prey was already caught, already defeated, already his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena could not have moved if she had wanted to. Fear had frozen her in place, had turned her muscles to stone and her blood to ice. She could feel his eyes on her, could sense him studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. And she knew with absolute certainty that this man, whoever he was, whatever he was, represented danger of a magnitude she had never before encountered. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel being ground together, but there was intelligence in it, and something else, something that might have been surprise or possibly even concern, though Elena thought she might be imagining that because it seemed impossible that anything in this cursed place would feel concern for her. "You're bleeding," he said, and it took Elena several seconds to process the words, to understand that he was not threatening her, or demanding explanations, or doing any of the things she had expected. He was simply stating a fact, noting the cuts on her wrists where the rope had bitten deep, the blood on her feet from the rough journey through the forest. Elena tried to speak, tried to force words out of her throat, but her voice seemed to have deserted her, seemed to have fled along with her courage and her hope, leaving behind only empty air and terrified silence. She stared at the man, at the dark shape of him against the darker forest, and she could not make her mouth form words, could not make her tongue cooperate, could barely even make her lungs draw breath. He took a step toward her, and Elena flinched backward instinctively, her body responding to threat even when her mind was too overwhelmed to direct it. The man stopped immediately, held up one hand palm forward in what might have been meant as a calming gesture, though Elena was far beyond being calmed by simple movements or reassuring words. "Easy," he said, using the same tone one might use with a frightened horse, low and steady and deliberately unthreatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're on my land, but I'm not going to hurt you. His land." The words penetrated slowly, fighting their way through the fog of terror that had descended over Elena's mind. His land, which meant this was the Forbidden Vale, and this was someone who lived here, someone who had made his home in this cursed place where no one else dared to venture, which meant this man was either very brave or very foolish or very dangerous, or possibly all three at once. She found her voice finally, though it came out as little more than a whisper, rough and shaking. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, and though Elena still could not see his face clearly in the darkness, she had the impression that he was studying her with renewed interest, as though her question had surprised him somehow, as though he had expected her to already know who he was. "My name is Alistair," he said after a pause that stretched just a beat too long. "Alistair Draven. And you are trespassing in the Forbidden Vale." The name meant nothing to Elena, yet everything at the same time. She had heard stories all her life about the cursed king who ruled the Forbidden Vale, the man who had been transformed into something monstrous. But the stories had never given him a name, had never made him real enough to possess something as human and ordinary as a name. He had always been simply the king, the monster, the curse, an abstract threat used to frighten children into obedience and to justify the blood prices that Silverthorn and the other villages paid to keep him contained within his mountain prison. But now he stood before her with a name, Alistair Draven, and the reality of him was somehow both more and less terrifying than the stories had prepared her for. He was solid and present, not some distant nightmare, but a man who breathed and spoke and noticed when strangers bled on his land, and that humanity, however slight, was more unsettling than any amount of abstract monstrousness would have been. "I didn't choose to trespass," Elena managed to say, though her voice still shook and her legs felt weak beneath her. "I was brought here. They dragged me to the gates and threw me inside and locked me in." Even in the darkness, she saw him go completely still at her words, saw his entire body tense as though she had struck him. The silence stretched between them for several long seconds, and Elena could hear nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant crackling of the fire in the clearing behind her, and her own heartbeat drumming frantically against her ribs. "They sent you as tribute," Alistair said finally, and it was not a question. His voice had gone flat, emptied of whatever warmth or concern it might have held before, replaced by something cold and hard and bitter. Another sacrifice to appease the monster in the mountains. Another innocent life thrown away to maintain their comfortable fiction that I am the threat, that I am the danger that needs to be contained. Elena did not know how to respond to that, did not know whether to confirm or deny or simply remain silent, so she said nothing and simply stood there shivering in the cold mountain air, her bound wrists held awkwardly in front of her, her bleeding feet throbbing with every heartbeat. Alistair moved suddenly, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides, and Elena flinched backward again, but there was nowhere to go. A tree pressed against her back and rocks to either side, and then he was right in front of her, close enough that she could finally see his face in the dim light. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and strong features that might have been handsome if not for the hardness carved into every line, the bitterness etched around his mouth and eyes. His eyes were pale, gray or perhaps blue. It was difficult to tell in the darkness, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but also made it impossible to do so, as though he were searching for something in her face. some answer to a question he had not yet asked. He reached toward her, and Elena's breath caught in her throat, her body going rigid with terror, but his hands moved not to her throat or her face, but to her wrists, to the ropes that bound them. His fingers worked at the knots with surprising gentleness, surprising dexterity, and within moments the ropes fell away, leaving her wrists raw and bleeding but free. Elena gasped as blood rushed back into her hands, bringing with it 1,000 pinpricks of pain, and she nearly dropped to her knees from the sudden sensation. Alistair caught her elbow, steadying her, and his touch was warm despite the cold air, warm and solid and strangely reassuring, even though every instinct screamed that she should fear this man, should run from him, should do anything except stand here allowing him to touch her. But running was impossible. She was injured and exhausted and lost in unfamiliar territory. And besides, some part of her recognized that if he had wanted to hurt her, if he had wanted to kill her, he would have done so already, would not have bothered untying her ropes or showing any concern for her injuries. "Come inside," he said, releasing her elbow and stepping back to give her space. "You need those wounds cleaned and dressed before infection sets in, and you need food and rest. We can discuss the situation once you're no longer in immediate danger of collapsing." Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some semblance of pride and independence, but she knew he was right. She was in no condition to survive the night in the forest, and refusing his help out of misplaced dignity would accomplish nothing except her own death. So she nodded, a small jerky movement, and allowed him to lead her toward the clearing and the small cabin with its welcoming fire and promise of warmth and safety, however temporary that safety might prove to be. The interior of the cabin was small but well-maintained, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough wooden table and chairs occupying the center of the single room. There was a bed in one corner, covered with furs and blankets, and shelves lined with books and jars and various implements whose purposes Elena could not immediately determine. The fire burning in the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the walls and filled the space with warmth that made Elena realize just how cold she had been, how deeply the mountain air had chilled her. Alistair gestured toward one of the chairs near the fire, and Elena sank into it gratefully, her legs trembling with exhaustion and relief. He moved around the cabin with efficient movements, gathering supplies, a basin of water and clean cloths, and what looked like medicinal herbs, and Elena watched him with wary attention, still not quite able to believe that the monster of Silverthorn's nightmares was treating her with such care, such consideration. He knelt in front of her chair and reached for her feet, and Elena jerked them back instinctively, not wanting him to touch her, not wanting to feel that strange warmth again, or to acknowledge the confusing mixture of fear and something else that his presence provoked. But he simply looked up at her with those pale eyes and said, "I need to clean the cuts. The forest floor is full of things that can poison a wound. If you want to keep your feet, you'll let me help you." Elena understood the logic of his words, understood that pride was a luxury she could not afford in her current situation, so she forced herself to relax, to extend her feet toward him, to allow him to take one bleeding foot in his hands and begin cleaning away the dirt and blood with careful strokes of the damp cloth. His touch was gentle, more gentle than she would have thought possible from hands so large and clearly so capable of violence, and he worked in silence for several minutes, focused entirely on his task. "How old are you?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from his work. 22, Elena answered, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "And what did you do to warrant being sacrificed? What crime did they accuse you of?" Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes at the question, at the reminder of everything that had led to this moment, but she forced them back, refused to give in to the grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm her. "They said I murdered the beta's daughter. She came to me sick, dying, and I tried to help her. Tried everything I knew. But she died anyway. So they decided I must have poisoned her, must have killed her deliberately, and they condemned me for it." Alistair's hands stilled on her foot for just a moment before resuming their work. "And did you? Poison her?" "No." The word came out fierce and certain, all the conviction Elena possessed compressed into that single syllable. I tried to save her. I did everything in my power to save her. But she was too far gone by the time they brought her to me. The sickness had spread too deep, and I didn't have the knowledge or the resources to pull her back. I'm not a master healer. I'm just an apprentice, just a girl who learned what she could from her mother and the village healer, and it wasn't enough. He finished cleaning her feet and began wrapping them in strips of clean cloth with the same careful attention he had shown throughout. Your mother was a healer? Yes. She died when I was 11. Fever took her. The same fever that took half the village that winter. After that, I was apprenticed to Marjorie, the village healer, and she taught me everything she knew until she died 5 years later. I've been alone since then, trying to maintain her practice, trying to help people the way she helped them, but Elena's voice trailed off. What was there to say? That she had failed? That her best had not been good enough? That the village had turned on her the moment she proved to be fallible, to be human, to be less than the perfect instrument of healing they had wanted her to be? Alistair moved to her wrists, cleaning the rope burns with the same methodical care he had shown her feet. They blamed you because it was easier than accepting that sometimes people die, despite our best efforts. They blamed you because they needed someone to punish, someone to make responsible for their grief and their fear. And you were convenient. An orphan, a woman, someone with knowledge that made them uncomfortable. You were the perfect scapegoat. His words struck her with the force of truth, with the weight of someone who understood exactly what had happened to her because he had experienced something similar himself. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the hardness in his face to the pain beneath it, the old wounds that had never properly healed, the scars that went deeper than skin. What happened to you? She asked quietly. The stories say you were cursed, that you became a monster, but they never say why. They never explain what you did to deserve such a punishment. Alistair finished binding her wrists and sat back on his heels, his face carefully neutral. The stories are wrong about many things. I was cursed, that much is true, but not for any crime I committed. I was framed, betrayed by people I trusted, condemned for actions I never took, and murders I never committed. The curse was meant to destroy me, to turn me into the monster they claimed I already was. And in some ways, it succeeded, but not in the ways they intended. He stood and moved away from her, walking to the fireplace and staring into the flames as though they held answers to questions he did not want to ask. The Moonfang Pack rules the territories surrounding this vale. They are powerful and wealthy, and utterly corrupt, and they wanted the lands that belonged to my family, the resources and the trade routes and the political influence that came with controlling this region. But they could not simply take what they wanted, not without cause, not without some justification that would satisfy the other packs and kingdoms. So they manufactured one. Elena leaned forward in her chair, drawn into his story despite her fear, despite her exhaustion. How? They murdered 3 of their own people, important people, people whose deaths would demand justice and retribution. And they made it look as though I was responsible, as though I had ordered the killings in some insane attempt to expand my territory, or settle old grievances, or whatever motivation they claimed I possessed. The evidence was perfect, too perfect, but no one questioned it because why would the Moonfang Pack lie about such a thing? Why would they sacrifice their own people to frame someone else? It seemed impossible, unthinkable, so everyone believed them, and I was condemned without trial, without the opportunity to defend myself or present evidence of my innocence. He turned from the fire to face her again, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so present, that Elena felt it like a physical blow. The curse was their final touch, their way of ensuring I could never return, could never reclaim what they had stolen. They brought in a witch, someone skilled in dark magic, and she bound me with a curse that transforms me into a beast when the moon is full, into something savage and mindless and dangerous. They told everyone that the curse was punishment from the gods, divine judgment for my crimes, and they used it to justify my exile, my imprisonment in this vale. And then they took everything: my lands, my title, my people, my reputation. Everything I had, everything I was, They stripped it all away and left me here to rot in isolation while they prospered on what they had stolen. The bitterness in his voice was like poison, concentrated and potent, and Elena understood suddenly why he lived alone in this cabin, why he had remained here in the Forbidden Vale rather than trying to flee or fight back. What was there to fight for when everything had already been taken? Where was there to flee to when the entire world believed you were a monster? "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt inadequate, felt small and useless in the face of such profound injustice, but they were all she had to offer. "I'm sorry that happened to you. No one deserves that. No one deserves to be destroyed so completely for something they didn't do." Alistair studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You believe me." It was not a question, but Elena answered anyway. "Yes, I believe you. I know what it's like to be blamed for something you didn't do, to have people turn on you without evidence, without proof, simply because it's convenient for them to believe you're guilty. I know what it feels like to stand there trying to defend yourself while everyone has already decided your fate. So yes, I believe you." Something shifted in his face at her words, some small softening of the hard lines around his mouth and eyes, and he nodded slowly. "Thank you. It's been a long time since anyone believed me, since anyone looked at me and saw something other than the monster they've been told I am." He moved to the shelves and retrieved a jar, unscrewing the lid and bringing it to her. "This is a salve. It will help with the pain and speed the healing of your wounds. Apply it twice daily, more if the pain is severe." He handed her the jar and then moved to the small kitchen area of the cabin, where he began preparing food, cutting bread and cheese, and some kind of dried meat, arranging it all on a wooden plate. Elena opened the jar and sniffed the contents, recognizing immediately the scent of comfrey and calendula mixed with something else, something that smelled faintly of pine and clean earth. She dipped her fingers into the salve and began applying it to her wrists, feeling immediate relief as the cool paste soothed the burning rope burns. The salve was well made, expertly mixed, and she wondered if Alistair had prepared it himself, or if he had someone who provided such things for him, someone who knew the healing arts as well as she did. He brought her the plate of food and a cup of water, and Elena realized suddenly that she was ravenously hungry, that she had not eaten since the morning of her arrest, had consumed nothing but stale bread and dirty water for 3 days while locked in the temple cellar. She ate quickly, almost desperately, forcing herself to slow down only when she noticed Alistair watching her with an expression that might have been concern or possibly pity. "When did you last eat?" he asked. 3 days ago. They locked me in the temple cellar after they accused me, and they only gave me 1 piece of bread, nothing else." Elena swallowed the last of the cheese and took a long drink of water, feeling strength beginning to seep back into her body, feeling the fog of exhaustion and fear starting to lift slightly. Alistair's jaw tightened at her words, and she saw his hands curl into fists at his sides before he deliberately relaxed them. "The Moonfang Pack grows bolder every year. When I was first exiled, they sent criminals, people who had actually committed crimes and been sentenced to death. Then they began sending debtors, people who owed money or had fallen afoul of their laws in minor ways. And now they send innocent girls who had the misfortune to fail at an impossible task. The blood price was supposed to be about justice, about sending me those who deserved punishment, but it has become nothing more than a convenient way to dispose of anyone who inconveniences them." "You've received others before me?" Elena asked, trying to imagine what had happened to those previous sacrifices, what fate they had met at the hands of this man who claimed to be innocent, but who lived alone in a cursed forest, and who transformed into a beast when the moon was full. Alistair nodded slowly. "Over the years, yes. Not many. Perhaps 1 every few years. But enough. I've tried to help those who would accept help, offered them shelter and supplies and guidance on how to survive in the forest or escape to lands beyond the Moonfang Pack's reach. Some accepted and left. Some chose to stay here in the Vale, building lives away from the cruelty of the villages. And some..." He paused, and pain flickered across his face. "Some arrived already too injured or too sick to be saved, and I did what I could to make their final hours comfortable." Elena absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the image of a man who had helped strangers and eased the suffering of the dying with the stories of the monster who devoured anyone who entered his territory. The villages don't know you've been helping people. They think everyone who comes here dies, that you kill them or the curse kills them or the forest kills them. They think the Forbidden Vale is a death sentence. Let them think that, Alistair said, his voice harsh. Let them believe their comfortable lies. The fear keeps them away, keeps them from sending more people here, and that suits me fine. I have no interest in hosting a parade of victims sacrificed to appease their guilty consciences. He moved to the door of the cabin and stood there for a moment, looking out into the darkness. The moon will be full in 3 nights. When that happens, I will transform, and I will not be myself, will not be in control of my actions or my thoughts. I have built a secure place deep in the forest where I chain myself when the change comes, where I cannot hurt anyone or escape to do damage elsewhere. You will need to remain in this cabin while I'm gone. Keep the door barred and the fire burning, and do not venture outside for any reason until I return. Elena felt ice forming in her stomach at his words, at the casual way he described losing himself to the beast, at the implications of what might happen if she did not follow his instructions precisely. How long does it last? The transformation? 3 nights, from moonrise to moonset. By the 4th morning, I will be myself again and I will return here. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. I know you have no reason to trust me, no reason to believe that I will not harm you when the beast takes over. But I need you to understand that I will do everything in my power to protect you from that part of myself. The chains are strong. The location is remote. And in all the years since the curse was placed, I have never broken free or harmed anyone during the transformation. You will be safe here if you remain inside. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, the understanding that she was trapped in a cabin in the middle of a cursed forest with a man who turned into a monster 3 nights every month, and that her only options were to trust him or to flee into a wilderness that would almost certainly kill her before morning. It was not much of a choice, but it was the only choice she had, so she would make it and deal with the consequences as they came. I have questions, she said finally, forcing her voice to work despite the fear clawing at her throat. About the curse, about the Moonfang Pack, about everything. But I'm too exhausted to think clearly right now, and I suspect you're tired of answering questions from strangers who have been thrown into your life without warning or consent. Can we talk more tomorrow, once I've rested and recovered enough to have a proper conversation? A ghost of a smile touched Alistair's lips, so faint and so brief that Elena thought she might have imagined it. Yes, tomorrow we can talk. For now, you should rest. You can have the bed. I'll sleep in the chair by the fire. You'll be warm enough with the furs and blankets, and I promise I will not disturb you or enter that corner of the cabin unless you ask me to. Elena wanted to protest, wanted to insist that she could not possibly take his bed while he sat in a chair all night. But exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight, dragging her down toward sleep whether she wanted it or not. And she knew that if she did not lie down soon, she would simply collapse where she sat. So she stood on shaky legs and made her way to the bed, climbing under the furs and blankets that smelled of pine and wood smoke and something wild and clean. And she felt warmth enveloping her immediately, soaking into her chilled bones and aching muscles. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Alistair settling into the chair by the fire, his face turned toward the flames, his expression distant and sad and weary in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the weight of years spent alone. Years spent carrying the burden of a curse he did not deserve and an exile he had not earned. Elena woke to the smell of cooking food and the sound of rain drumming against the roof of the cabin. For a moment she was disoriented, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings and the softness of the furs against her skin. And then memory came rushing back in a cold wave that made her stomach clench and her breath catch in her throat. The village, the accusation, the journey to the Forbidden Vale, Alistair Draven and his story of betrayal and curses and transformation into a beast. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles and the persistent ache in her feet and wrists. Pale gray light filtered through the single window of the cabin, and Elena realized it must be morning, though the heavy clouds and steady rain made it difficult to judge the time with any precision. She looked toward the fireplace and saw Alistair standing at the small stove, his back to her as he tended something in an iron pot that sent savory steam curling toward the ceiling. He must have heard her movement because he turned slightly and nodded in acknowledgement. "Good morning. How do you feel?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. Her body ached and her wounds throbbed with dull persistence, but she was alive and warm and safe, which was more than she had expected when the guards had shoved her through the gates of the Vale. Sore, tired, but better than I was last night. That's to be expected. Rest and regular food will help with the recovery. He ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. Stew. Rabbit and root vegetables. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling. Elena accepted the bowl gratefully and took a tentative sip, feeling warmth spread through her chest as the savory broth touched her tongue. The stew was simple but well made, seasoned with herbs she recognized, thyme and rosemary and something earthy that might have been wild mushroom. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and watched Alistair as he moved around the cabin, straightening items that did not need straightening, adjusting things that were already perfectly in place, clearly uncomfortable with her presence but trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. When she had finished eating, Elena set the bowl aside and finally voiced the question that had been haunting her since she had awakened. "Why are you being kind to me? The villages believe you're a monster, believe you kill anyone who enters your territory, but you've shown me nothing but compassion since I arrived. You untied me, treated my wounds, fed me, gave me shelter. Why?" Alistair was silent for a long moment, standing with his back to her, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and carefully controlled. "Because I remember what it feels like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of people who have already decided your fate, to be afraid and alone and certain that no one will help you. I remember what it feels like to be condemned for something you didn't do, to stand there trying to defend yourself while everyone ignores your words and believes the worst of you. I would not wish that experience on anyone, and I will not become the monster they claim I am, simply because they expect it of me." He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw and present that Elena felt an answering ache in her own chest. "Besides, you're different from the others they've sent. Most of the previous sacrifices were criminals or debtors, people who had actually done something to warrant punishment, even if the punishment itself was excessive. But you're innocent, completely innocent, and they condemned you anyway because it was convenient, because you made them uncomfortable with your knowledge and your independence. That kind of casual cruelty, that willingness to destroy an innocent life to avoid facing their own failures, it makes me angrier than anything the Moonfang Pack has done to me personally." Elena absorbed his words, feeling something shift in her understanding of this man who lived alone in a cursed forest. He was not the monster of the stories, was not the mindless beast that terrorized the countryside and devoured innocent travelers. He was simply a man who had been wronged, who had been betrayed and exiled and cursed, and who had somehow managed to retain his humanity despite everything that had been done to him. "Tell me about the curse," she said quietly. "You said it transforms you into a beast when the moon is full, but you haven't explained exactly what that means. What happens to you? What does the beast do?" Alistair moved to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked forest, his jaw tight. "The transformation begins at moonrise on the first night of the full moon. I can feel it building throughout the day, a pressure beneath my skin, an itch I cannot scratch, a growing awareness of the beast stirring inside me. When the moon finally rises and its light touches my skin, the change happens whether I want it to or not. My bones break and reform. My muscles tear and rebuild. My entire body reconstructs itself into something that is neither fully human nor fully wolf, but something in between, something that should not exist." He paused, and Elena could see his hands curling into fists at his sides, could see the tension radiating through his entire frame. "The pain is extraordinary, unlike anything I can adequately describe. It feels as though I'm being torn apart from the inside, as though every nerve in my body is on fire, as though I'm dying and being reborn simultaneously. And when the transformation is complete, when I'm fully beast, I lose myself. My thoughts become animal thoughts, driven by instinct and hunger and rage. My memories disappear. My identity disappears. Everything that makes me Alistair Draven vanishes, and all that remains is the creature, the monster, the thing that wants only to hunt and kill and feed. Elena felt cold spreading through her chest at his description, at the casual way he described such horror, such profound violation of self. And this happens every month? For 3 full nights? Every month without fail. The curse is absolute and unbreakable, or at least I have not found a way to break it despite years of searching, despite consulting every text on magic and curses I could find or steal or purchase through intermediaries. The witch who cast it was powerful, and she did her work well. The curse is tied not just to me, but to my bloodline, to the very essence of what I am, and severing it would require magic of a level I cannot access or comprehend. He turned from the window to face her fully, and his expression was bleak. That's why I chain myself during the full moon, why I have built a secure location deep in the forest where the beast cannot escape or harm anyone. The chains are spelled silver, blessed by a priest I paid to perform the ritual without asking questions, and they burn the beast's skin, cause it pain that is sufficient to keep it contained but not sufficient to drive it into such a frenzy that it might actually break free. It's a delicate balance, and I've spent years perfecting it, learning exactly how much restraint is needed to hold the creature without pushing it beyond control. Elena tried to imagine what it must be like to live with such a curse, to know that 3 nights every month you would lose yourself completely, would become something savage and dangerous and utterly beyond your own control. The horror of it, the sheer relentless cruelty of such a punishment, made her feel sick. "I'm sorry," she said again, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. No one should have to endure that. No one should be forced to live with such suffering because of crimes they never committed. "The people who cursed me believe I deserve it," Alistair said flatly. "The Moonfang Pack believes I deserve it. The villages that send their sacrifices here believe I deserve it. Everyone believes I deserve it except for me and the handful of people who know the truth, and their opinions count for nothing in the face of such widespread certainty." He moved back to the table and sat down across from her, and for the first time since she had met him, Elena saw exhaustion in his face, saw the weight of years spent carrying an unbearable burden. "I've considered ending it, you know. Considered simply walking out of my chains during the transformation and letting the beast run free, letting it do whatever damage it will until someone finally puts it down. It would be easier than continuing like this. Easier than spending year after year in isolation, knowing that I will never reclaim what was stolen from me, never clear my name, never have justice for what was done to me." "But you haven't done it," Elena said softly. "You haven't let the beast free, haven't given up, haven't surrendered to despair despite having every reason to do so." "Why?" Alistair looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, became less closed off, less guarded. "Because surrendering would be letting them win. Because if I become the monster they claim I am, then they were right all along. Then their lies become truth and their betrayal becomes justified. And I refuse to give them that satisfaction. I refuse to let them be right about me, even if it means spending the rest of my life alone in this cursed forest, fighting against a beast that lives inside my own skin." The conviction in his voice, the sheer stubborn determination, made Elena feel something shift in her chest, some small spark of admiration for this man who had been broken but not destroyed, who had been exiled but not defeated. She understood that determination, understood the refusal to let your enemies define you or destroy you, because she had felt the same thing when the village council had condemned her, when Sister Callista had declared her a murderer, when the guards had dragged her away while she was still trying to explain, still trying to make them understand. "What will you do with me?" she asked quietly. "Now that I'm here, now that I know your story and you know mine, what happens next? Do I stay here in this cabin forever? Do I try to escape to lands beyond the Moonfang Pack's reach? Do I simply wait until the curse consumes you completely and hope that I'm somewhere else when it happens? Alistair leaned back in his chair, considering her questions. That depends on what you want. I can provide you with supplies and directions to reach territories where the Moonfang Pack has no influence, places where you could build a new life without fear of being recognized or recaptured. Or you can stay here in the Vale, build a home of your own in one of the abandoned settlements deeper in the forest. There are others living here, people who have fled the villages or been cast out for various reasons, and they've formed small communities where they look after each other and survive without interference from the outside world. Others? Elena had not expected that, had assumed Alistair lived in complete isolation except for the occasional unwilling visitor. Not many, perhaps 20 or 30 souls scattered across the Vale in groups of 3 or 4. They keep to themselves mostly, and I keep to myself, but we maintain a loose network of mutual aid. I hunt and trade meat for things I cannot make or grow myself. They provide herbs and medicines and news of the outside world when travelers pass through their settlements. It's not a perfect system, but it works well enough. Elena absorbed this information, trying to imagine a life here in the Forbidden Vale, surrounded by forest and mountains and the constant awareness of the curse that hung over everything. It would be a hard life, a lonely life, but it would be free of the judgment and cruelty she had experienced in Silverthorn, free of the constant fear of saying the wrong thing or failing to meet impossible expectations. And there would be others here, people who understood what it meant to be cast out, who would not judge her for knowledge that made them uncomfortable or blame her for failures that were beyond her control. I need time to think about it, she said finally. I need to process everything that's happened, everything I've learned, before I can make a decision about what comes next. But I appreciate you giving me options, appreciating you not simply deciding my fate without consulting me. You've had enough people making decisions for you, Alistair said. You deserve the chance to choose your own path, even if all the available paths are difficult ones. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain and the crackling of the fire, and Elena found herself studying Alistair's face, noting details she had missed in the darkness and chaos of the previous night. He was handsome in a harsh way, all sharp angles and strong bones, with the kind of face that would be severe in repose, but might be striking if he ever smiled. His hands were scarred, marked by years of hard work and harder living, and there was a wariness in the way he held himself, as though he expected attack or betrayal at any moment, as though he had learned through bitter experience that safety was an illusion, and trust was a luxury he could not afford. You said the curse is tied to your bloodline, Elena said, breaking the silence. Does that mean it could be passed to your children? If you ever had children? Does it mean the curse would continue beyond your lifetime? Alistair's face darkened at the question, and he looked away. I don't know. The witch who cast the curse never explained its full parameters, never told me whether it would affect future generations or die with me. But it doesn't matter because I will never have children, will never subject anyone to the risk of inheriting this horror. The Draven line ends with me, and perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps this curse is simply the final extinction of a family that should never have tried to maintain power in a world this corrupt and cruel. That's a bleak view, Elena said softly. It's a realistic view. I've had years to come to terms with my situation, years to understand that some things cannot be fixed or redeemed or overcome. The curse is one of those things. It will be with me until I die. And when I die, it will hopefully die with me, and the world will be better for my absence. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that his life had value beyond simply being a vessel for a curse he never deserved. But she could see in his face that he had heard such arguments before, had considered them, and rejected them, and that nothing she could say would change his mind or ease his pain. So instead, she simply nodded and said, I understand. They spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship, Alistair teaching Elena the layout of the cabin and showing her where supplies were stored, where water could be fetched from a nearby stream, how to bank the fire to keep it burning through the night. He gave her clean clothes to replace her torn and bloodied dress, simple garments of homespun wool and linen that were too large for her frame, but infinitely more practical than what she had been wearing. And he answered her questions about the Forbidden Vale, about the forest and the mountains and the creatures that inhabited them, about which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, about where the other settlements were located and what kind of people lived in them. As evening approached and the rain finally began to taper off, Elena found herself feeling more at ease in Alistair's presence, more comfortable with the strange situation in which she found herself. He was not the monster of the stories, was not the threat she had been taught to fear. He was simply a man trying to survive an impossible situation with whatever dignity and humanity he could maintain, and she respected that, admired it even, because she knew from her own experience how difficult it was to hold on to yourself when the entire world seemed determined to strip away everything that made you who you were. That night, as she lay in the bed surrounded by furs and blankets, Elena thought about her options, about the choice Alistair had presented to her. She could leave the Vale, could try to start over in some distant territory where no one knew her name or her story, where she could rebuild her life as a healer and never speak of Silverthorn or the Moonfang Pack or the Cursed King in the mountains. It would be the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that would give her the best chance of living a long and relatively peaceful life. But something in her resisted that option, resisted the idea of running away, of letting the people who had wronged her simply continue their lives without consequence or accountability. She thought of the Beta, sitting in his comfortable home while his daughter lay cold in the ground, convinced that justice had been served and that the girl who had tried to save her had been appropriately punished. She thought of Sister Callista, presiding over her temple with self-righteous satisfaction, certain that she had rooted out corruption and protected the village from a dangerous influence. She thought of the guards who had dragged her to the gates of the Vale without a moment's hesitation or regret, who had returned to their families and their ordinary lives as though they had done nothing more significant than dispose of unwanted refuse. And she thought of Alistair, trapped in this forest by a curse he did not deserve, exiled for crimes he never committed, spending his life in isolation while the people who had actually betrayed and murdered and lied prospered on what they had stolen from him. The injustice of it burned in her chest like a coal, hot and persistent, and she realized with sudden clarity that she did not want to simply escape and forget. She wanted justice. She wanted truth. She wanted the people responsible for all this suffering to face consequences for their actions. But how could she possibly achieve such a thing? She was one woman, alone and powerless, with no allies and no resources beyond what Alistair could provide. The Moonfang Pack was enormous and wealthy and politically connected, capable of crushing any threat to their authority with overwhelming force. And even if she could somehow gather evidence of their crimes, who would believe her? Who would take the word of an exiled orphan and a cursed king over the testimony of respected pack leaders and village officials? The problem seemed insurmountable, impossible. But Elena had never been one to simply accept impossibility without at least trying to find a solution. She had learned from her mother and from Marjorie that there was always another approach, always another angle to consider, always another combination of elements that might produce the desired result, even when everything else had failed. Healing was as much about creativity and persistence as it was about knowledge, and perhaps the same principles could be applied to this very different kind of problem. She fell asleep thinking about curses and evidence and justice, about ways to fight back against an enemy that seemed invulnerable, and her dreams were full of shadows and moonlight and the sound of chains rattling in darkness. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed during the night and left behind crystalline air and a forest that sparkled with frost. Alistair was already awake when Elena rose, standing outside the cabin and staring toward the mountains with an expression of such profound weariness that Elena felt her heart ache in sympathy. "The moon will be full tonight," he said without looking at her, his voice flat and emotionless. "I need to go to my chains before sunset. Need to be secured before moonrise. You'll remain here in the cabin with the door barred. There's enough food and water to last you 3 days, and I've left instructions on the table for what to do if I don't return by the 4th morning." "Don't return?" Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. "What do you mean if you don't return? You said the chains have held for years, said you've never broken free." They've held so far, Alistair corrected, still not looking at her. But the curse grows stronger over time, and the beast becomes more powerful with each transformation. Eventually, the chains will not be enough, and when that day comes, the beast will break free and do whatever damage it can before someone manages to kill it. I hope that day is still far in the future, but I cannot guarantee it, so I leave instructions just in case. He finally turned to face her, and the resignation in his eyes was heartbreaking. If I don't return, you should gather what supplies you can carry and head north. Follow the stream for 2 days until you reach a settlement called Thornhaven. Tell them Alistair sent you, and they'll provide you with additional supplies and directions to reach territories beyond the Moonfang Pack's influence. They're good people, survivors like yourself, and they'll help you. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that he would return, that the chains would hold, that she refused to accept his fatalistic certainty that this might be his final transformation. But she could see in his face that he had made peace with the possibility of his own death, had accepted it as an inevitable outcome of a situation he could not control, and that her protests would accomplish nothing except making him feel worse about something he already dreaded. "I'll wait for you," she said simply. "And when you return, we're going to talk about finding a way to break this curse, because I refuse to accept that it's unbreakable just because no one has broken it yet." For the first time since she had met him, Alistair smiled, a small sad curve of his lips that transformed his harsh face into something almost gentle. "You're stubborn." "I've been told that before," Elena replied. "Usually, right before I prove that my stubborn refusal to accept defeat is actually an asset, rather than a flaw." "I hope you're right," Alistair said quietly. "I hope your stubbornness is powerful enough to find answers where I have found only dead ends and disappointment. But for now, I need to go. The sun is already climbing, and I have preparations to make before moonrise." He gathered supplies from inside the cabin, a pack filled with items Elena could not identify, and then he walked to the door and paused, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you, Elena. Thank you for believing me, for seeing me as something other than the monster everyone else sees. It's been a long time since anyone looked at me with anything other than fear or hatred, and your kindness means more than you know." Before Elena could respond, before she could find words adequate to express what she was feeling, Alistair turned and walked into the forest, disappearing among the trees with the silent grace of someone who had spent years learning every path and shadow of this wilderness. And Elena stood in the doorway of the cabin watching until she could no longer see any trace of him, until the forest had swallowed him completely, and then she went inside and barred the door and sat by the fire to wait for night to fall and the transformation to begin. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as Elena waited for moonrise. She had barred the door as Alistair had instructed, had checked and rechecked the security of the cabin, had inventoried the supplies he had left for her, but none of these activities could distract her from the growing tension that filled the air like the pressure before a storm. She could feel something building, something vast and terrible approaching, and though she could not have explained how she knew, she was certain that the moment of transformation was drawing near. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Elena found herself drawn to the window, unable to look away from the forest, even though she knew there was nothing to see, knew that Alistair was somewhere deep in the wilderness, chained and waiting for the curse to claim him. She thought about what he had described, the pain of bones breaking and reforming, the loss of self as the beast took control, the monthly cycle of death and rebirth that had defined his existence for years. The cruelty of it made her chest ache, made her hands curl into fists against the windowsill. And then, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elena heard it, a howl, distant but unmistakable, rising from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound of such profound anguish and rage that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The sound went on, climbing higher and higher until it finally broke and fell silent, and in the silence that followed, Elena realized she was trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs. The transformation had begun. Elena forced herself to step back from the window, forced herself to turn away from the darkness outside and focus on the interior of the cabin. She needed to stay calm, needed to keep herself occupied, needed to do something other than stand there imagining what Alistair was experiencing. What horrors were unfolding in whatever remote location he had chosen for his imprisonment. She moved to the bookshelf and began examining the volumes stored there, noting that many of them dealt with magic and curses and the history of the region, and she selected several that looked promising and carried them to the table near the fire. For the next several hours, Elena read, forcing herself to concentrate on the words, even when more howls echoed through the forest, even when she heard what might have been the rattle of chains or the crash of something large moving through the undergrowth. The books were fascinating despite the circumstances, full of information about the Moonfang Pack and their rise to power, about the various territories they controlled and the methods they used to maintain their authority. She learned about the political structure of the region, about alliances and betrayals, about the delicate balance of power that governed interactions between different packs and kingdoms. And she learned about curses, about the different types of magic that could be used to bind and transform and destroy, about the requirements for casting such spells and the methods that might be used to break them. Most of the information was technical and difficult to understand, written in language that assumed knowledge Elena did not possess, but she persisted, taking notes on anything that seemed potentially relevant, building a foundation of understanding that might eventually allow her to see patterns or connections that others had missed. As she read, a thought began to form in her mind. Small and tentative at first, but growing stronger the more she considered it. Alistair had said the curse was tied to his bloodline, that it was bound to the very essence of what he was. But he had also said the witch who cast it had been hired by the Moonfang Pack, had been brought in specifically to ensure his exile would be permanent, which meant the curse was not some ancient family affliction or divine punishment, but rather a constructed weapon, something made by human hands for a specific purpose. And if the curse had been made, if it had been crafted and cast and bound according to specific rules and requirements, then perhaps it could be unmade. Perhaps there was a way to reverse the process, to undo what had been done, if only she could understand the original spell well enough to identify its weaknesses or vulnerabilities. It was a long shot, probably an impossible shot, but it was something, a direction to explore, a possibility that had not yet been exhausted. Elena read through the night, barely noticing when exhaustion began to pull at her, barely registering the passage of time. The howls continued sporadically, sometimes close and sometimes distant, and once she heard what sounded like massive claws scraping against stone, a sound that made every hair on her body stand on end. But the cabin remained secure, the door held firm, and gradually Elena began to believe that Alistair had been right, that the chains would hold, that the beast would remain contained until the transformation reversed itself. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the window and illuminating the books scattered across the table, the pages of notes Elena had written in Alistair's careful script. She had found several references to curse-breaking, to rituals that might be used to sever magical bonds or weaken their hold, but all of them required either ingredients she did not have or knowledge she did not possess. Still, it was more than she had started with, more than anyone else had apparently discovered in all the years Alistair had been searching for a solution. The first day passed without incident. Elena ate sparingly from the supplies Alistair had left, drank water from the barrel he kept filled near the door, and continued her research, moving from one book to another as she searched for any additional information that might prove useful. She found a reference to an archive that was rumored to be kept somewhere in the mountains, a collection of old texts and documents related to the history of the region, and she made a note to ask Alistair about it when he returned. Assuming he returned, assuming the chains held for another 2 nights. The second day was harder. The howls seemed closer now, more frequent, and Elena could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the curse was behaving differently than it had in previous months. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that her fear was creating patterns where none existed, but the unease persisted. growing stronger as the day wore on and the sounds from the forest became increasingly agitated. On the evening of the second day, as the sun was setting and Elena was preparing for another long night of reading and waiting, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of chains breaking, metal snapping under immense pressure, followed by a roar that was nothing like the howls she had heard before. A sound of pure triumph and rage that seemed to shake the walls of the cabin. The beast had broken free. Elena's first instinct was panic, was the urge to run or hide or do anything except sit here waiting for death to come crashing through the door. But she forced herself to think, forced herself to breathe, forced herself to consider her options with whatever rationality she could muster. The cabin was sturdy, built to withstand harsh weather, and possibly even designed with the beast in mind, and the door was barred with heavy timber that would not yield easily. She had fire, which most wild animals feared, and she had the knowledge of herbs and plants that her mother and Marjorie had taught her, some of which might be useful if she could find a way to apply them. She moved quickly, gathering wood to build up the fire until it roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls and filling the cabin with heat and light. Then she searched through the jars and pouches on the shelves, looking for anything that might be useful, anything that could be burned or scattered or used as a weapon. She found wolfsbane, dangerous and toxic, and she crushed several of the dried flowers and scattered the powder near the door and windows, hoping the scent would deter the beast, or at least slow it down. The sounds outside grew closer, the crash of something massive moving through the forest, branches snapping and undergrowth being torn aside. Elena could hear heavy breathing now, could hear claws scraping against stone and earth. And then suddenly there was silence, absolute and complete, more terrifying than any amount of noise had been. She stood frozen in the center of the cabin, hardly daring to breathe. Every muscle tensed for fight or flight, even though she knew there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nothing to do except wait and hope that whatever happened next would be quick. The silence stretched on, seconds becoming minutes, and Elena began to wonder if the beast had moved on, if it had lost interest or been distracted by some other prey. And then something slammed against the door with such force that the entire cabin shook, and Elena screamed before she could stop herself, stumbled backward, and nearly fell. The door held, the bar across it creaking but not breaking, and for a moment there was silence again. Then another impact, harder than the first, and Elena heard wood beginning to splinter, heard the bar starting to crack under the assault. She looked around desperately for something, anything she could use to defend herself, and her eyes landed on the fireplace poker, a length of iron that was probably useless against a creature powerful enough to break spelled chains, but was better than nothing. She grabbed it and held it in front of her with both hands, her entire body shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The third impact shattered the bar completely, and the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a crash that seemed to stop Elena's heart. And there, framed in the doorway, backlit by moonlight, was the beast. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall if it stood fully upright, with massive shoulders and arms that ended in claws the length of daggers. Its body was covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural amber luminescence that held no trace of humanity, no hint of the man who lived inside this monstrous form. It stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, and Elena could see silver burns on its wrists where the chains had held it, could see old scars beneath the fur, evidence of years spent fighting against restraints. The beast took a step into the cabin, and Elena raised the poker, knowing it was futile, but unable to simply surrender without at least trying to fight. And then, something impossible happened. The beast stopped, its head tilting slightly, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was almost like recognition. It took another step forward, slower this time, almost cautious, and Elena saw its nostrils flare as it scented the air. "Alistair," Elena whispered, not really expecting any response, not believing the man was still present in any meaningful way, but needing to try, needing to reach for whatever fragment of humanity might remain. "Alistair, I know you're in there somewhere. I know you can fight this. You've been fighting it for years, and you can fight it now. Don't let the curse win. Don't let them make you into the monster they claim you are." The beast growled, low and threatening, but it did not attack. Instead, it took another step forward, close enough now that Elena could feel the heat radiating from its body, could smell the wild scent of fur and forest and something darker, something that was neither fully human nor fully animal. Its eyes remained fixed on her face, and Elena had the strange sensation that it was studying her, trying to understand what she was, trying to reconcile her presence with whatever instincts and urges drove it. "Please," Elena said, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I know you don't want to hurt me. I know that's not who you are, not what you want to be. Fight the curse, Alistair. Fight it." The beast's growl changed pitch, becoming something that was almost like a whine, and Elena saw confusion flicker across its inhuman features. It took another step, reached out one massive clawed hand toward her, and Elena forced herself to remain still, forced herself not to flinch away even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The clawed hand came closer, closer, until it was inches from her face, and then it stopped, trembling slightly, as though the beast was fighting some internal battle between what it wanted to do and what it was being compelled to do. And then, slowly, impossibly, the beast's hand lowered, moved past her face to her wrist where the rope burns were still visible despite days of healing. The claws, so sharp and deadly, touched the damaged skin with surprising gentleness, traced the marks with what might have been concern, or possibly recognition. And Elena understood suddenly that some part of Alistair remained. Some fragment of the man was still present even in the grip of the curse, still capable of remembering that he had treated these wounds, still capable of caring about whether they had healed properly. "That's right," Elena said softly, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "You remember? You remember treating my wounds, remember being kind to me even though you had no reason to be? You're still in there, Alistair. The curse hasn't consumed you completely. You can fight it." The beast made another sound, something between a growl and a whimper, and then it pulled its hand away and stepped backward, away from Elena, away from the temptation or threat or whatever she represented to its animal mind. It stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, and Elena could see the struggle playing out in its glowing eyes, could see humanity and instinct warring for control. And then the beast turned and fled, bursting out of the cabin and disappearing into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Elena stood frozen, the poker still raised in her trembling hands, unable to process what had just happened, unable to believe that she was still alive, that the beast had chosen to leave rather than attack. She lowered the poker slowly and moved to the shattered doorway, looking out into the darkness where the beast had vanished. She could hear it moving through the forest, could hear branches breaking and stones being displaced, but the sounds were growing fainter, more distant, as though the creature was deliberately putting space between itself and the cabin. Elena did not sleep that night. She could not have slept if she had wanted to, adrenaline and fear and confusion all combining to keep her wide awake and hyper-alert. She rebuilt the fire to maximum intensity, dragged the heavy table across the doorway to provide at least some barrier against another intrusion, and then she sat with her back against the wall, the poker across her knees, listening to the sounds of the forest and waiting for dawn. The third day dawned cold and clear, frost covering everything with a glittering layer of ice. Elena ventured outside cautiously, checking for any sign of the beast, but the forest seemed empty, peaceful, as though the previous night's terror had been nothing more than a nightmare. She could see tracks in the frost, massive paw prints that led away from the cabin and deeper into the wilderness, but they did not return, did not circle back toward the cabin or show any sign of the beast having lingered in the area. She spent the day repairing the damage to the cabin as best she could, using tools she found in a small shed behind the main structure to fashion a temporary bar for the door and to patch the splintered wood where the beast's assault had cracked the frame. It was rough work, not nearly as solid or secure as the original construction, but it would have to suffice until Alistair returned and could make proper repairs. If Alistair returned, Elena tried not to think about that possibility. tried not to imagine what it would mean if he did not come back, if the beast had run too far or broken through some final barrier that had kept the transformation reversible. She focused on the work, on the immediate tasks that needed completing, and she tried to ignore the fear that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. The sun was setting again when Elena heard footsteps approaching the cabin. She grabbed the poker immediately, moved to a position where she could see the door but was not directly in line with it, and waited with her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps were slow, uneven, and when the door finally opened, it was not the beast that entered, but Alistair, human once more, though he looked as though he had aged a decade in the 3 days since she had last seen him. He was covered in dirt and scratches, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face gray with exhaustion. He saw Elena standing there with the poker raised, and he stopped, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, and said in a voice raw from screaming or howling or both, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The chains broke. I tried to fight it, tried to keep control, but the beast was too strong, too determined. Did I hurt you? Please tell me I didn't hurt you." Elena lowered the poker and moved toward him, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of his obvious distress. "You didn't hurt me. You came to the cabin, you broke through the door, but you didn't attack. You stopped yourself. You fought the curse and you won, Alistair. You kept control enough to walk away." He stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language, as though her words made no sense. "That's impossible. When the beast is in control, when the transformation is complete, I don't remember anything. I don't have thoughts or memories or choices. I'm just gone, just absent, and the creature does whatever it wants without any input from me. I can't have stopped myself because myself wasn't present to make that choice." "But you did," Elena insisted. "You were there in the doorway, and you could have killed me easily, but instead you looked at my wrists, at the wounds you had treated, and you remembered. Some part of you recognized me, recognized what you had done for me, and that was enough to make you leave rather than hurt me. The curse didn't consume you completely, Alistair. You fought it, and you won." He shook his head slowly, denial and desperate hope warring in his expression. "That's never happened before. In all the years since I was cursed, I've never retained any control during the transformation, never had any awareness or agency. If what you're saying is true, if I really did stop myself from hurting you, then something has changed, something fundamental about the curse or about me, and I don't understand what or why or how." Elena helped him to a chair, noting the way he favored his left leg, the way he winced with every movement. "You're injured. The chains, when I broke them, the silver burned deeper than usual, and then I spent 3 days running through the forest trying to exhaust the beast, trying to keep it away from the cabin and away from you. I'll heal, I always do, but it takes time." He looked at the damaged door, at the makeshift repairs Elena had made, and fresh guilt crossed his face. "I could have killed you. If the curse had been just slightly stronger, if I had been slightly weaker, you would be dead now and it would be my fault." "But I'm not dead," Elena said firmly. "I'm alive, and you're alive, and something important happened during that transformation. The curse weakened somehow, or you grew stronger, or the bond between us affected the magic in ways neither of us expected. This is important, Alistair. This might be the breakthrough we need to break the curse completely." He looked at her with such raw vulnerability that Elena felt her chest tighten. "What bond between us? We barely know each other. You've been here less than a week." Elena sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. "I don't fully understand it either, but from the moment we met, I felt something, some connection that goes deeper than simple sympathy or shared experience. When you untied my wrists and treated my wounds, when you shared your story with me, something changed. Not just in how I see you, but in how I feel when I'm near you. It's like there's a thread connecting us, pulling us together. And I think that thread is what gave you the strength to fight the curse, to retain enough of yourself to choose to walk away." Alistair was silent for a long moment, studying her face with those pale eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Fated mates," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The old stories talk about such things, about bonds that form between certain individuals, connections that transcend logic or choice or conscious decision. I never believed in them, thought they were romantic nonsense, pretty lies told to make people feel special. But if what you're describing is real, if there truly is some bond between us that's strong enough to affect the curse, then perhaps those old stories were not lies after all. Can such a bond break a curse? Elena asked. I don't know. The texts I've read suggest that powerful emotional connections can sometimes interfere with magic, can create unpredictable effects or weaken spells that were cast without accounting for such variables. But I've never heard of a bond strong enough to break something as powerful as this curse. Never encountered any reference to such a thing being possible. He paused, and something like hope flickered in his expression. But then again, I've never had anyone believe in me before. Never had anyone see me as something other than the monster the curse has made me. Perhaps that makes all the difference. They talked late into the night, sharing theories and possibilities, examining the books Elena had found, and discussing potential approaches to breaking the curse. Alistair was amazed by the amount of research she had accomplished in just 3 days, impressed by her ability to understand complex concepts and make connections between disparate pieces of information. And Elena was struck by his intelligence, by the depth of knowledge he had accumulated during his years of isolation, by the way his mind worked through problems with methodical precision. As they worked together, Elena became increasingly aware of the connection between them, the way their thoughts seemed to flow naturally from one to the other, the way they could finish each other's sentences or anticipate each other's questions. It was unlike anything she had experienced before, an intimacy that felt both new and ancient, as though they had known each other for lifetimes rather than days. There's an archive, Alistair said suddenly as they were discussing possible sources of additional information. Deep in the mountains, in ruins that date back centuries before the Moonfang Pack rose to power. I've been there a few times over the years, searching for anything that might help break the curse. But the texts are difficult to access and many of them are written in languages I don't fully understand. If you're serious about wanting to help me, about wanting to find a way to end this, that archive might be our best chance. Then we'll go there, Elena said without hesitation. Tomorrow, as soon as you've recovered enough to travel. We'll search every text, translate every document, and we won't stop until we find what we need. Alistair smiled at her. A real smile this time. Not the sad ghost of an expression, but something genuine and warm. You're remarkable, do you know that? You've been through hell, had your entire life destroyed by people who should have protected you. And yet here you are offering to help a stranger break a curse that has nothing to do with you. Most people would take the supplies I offered and run as far from this place as they could get. Most people didn't have you choose to spare their life when you could easily have killed them, Elena replied. Most people didn't see you fight against a curse powerful enough to transform you into a monster and win, even if only for a moment. You showed me that there's still hope, still possibility for change and redemption even in the darkest circumstances. How could I walk away from that? They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to coals, and Elena felt something settle in her chest, some certainty that this was where she was meant to be, that her exile from Silverthorn had not been an ending but rather a beginning, the start of something important and necessary and right. She did not know if they would succeed in breaking the curse, did not know if they would find the answers they needed in the ancient archive, but she knew with absolute conviction that she would try, would fight with everything she had to help this man who had shown her kindness when he had no obligation to do so. And as she drifted toward sleep that night, warm and safe beside the fire while Alistair kept watch, Elena thought about bonds and fate, and the strange paths that led people to exactly where they needed to be, even when the journey seemed impossible and the destination unclear.